So this video is all about stereotypes, prejudice and discrimination, which is really all about us and them. Yes, those damn binaries are back. So this area of work is all about how, in our attempts to understand others, we tend to search for meaning by taking shortcuts. And that's because people's lives are rich, complex, and contingent. Contingent meaning it can only be understood in context. And all of this means that it takes a long time to get to know someone, so we often find ourselves having to approximate an understanding of them in a short amount of time so we can judge how to respond to them. And we rely on snapshots and glimpses of other people's lives and then just fill in the gaps. Those are the shortcuts to understanding that save time, but can sometimes be harmful when we're somehow convinced that the snapshot is actually a complete enough picture of the person, and the harm happens when those snapshots are either intentionally or unintentionally constructed to devalue the person in some way or another. Now let's start off with some definitions of those three keywords: stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, because they're all involved in this process of taking snapshots of people in ways that can do harm. So stereotypes. These are beliefs or associations that connect a whole group of people with certain traits or characteristics. And these things are not necessarily harmful, but when it is, it's called a negative stereotype. And prejudice, well, these are feelings that are generated from those stereotypes. Again, not necessarily harmful, but when it is, it's called a negative prejudice. And finally, discrimination. That's all about acting towards members of that group based on a prejudice or stereotype. Again, not necessarily negative, but when it is, we call it negative discrimination. So let's flesh this out briefly with an example in relation to gender. So a negative stereotype would be the belief that women are bad drivers. A negative prejudice would be when someone says they don't feel safe when a woman is driving, and a negative discrimination would be a company not hiring women as drivers. Basically, stereotypes are all about how we think, prejudice is all about how we feel, and discrimination is all about how we act. So, cognitions, emotions, behavior, if you like. Now, you can go to our prescribed text for all that fine-grained detail on the different theories and research that's been done in this area. I'm not going to go into that in these videos because the textbook does that well enough. What I want to do is to present to you some ideas that might hook into some broader social issues to provide you with a bit of stimulus to generate some of that critical thinking with your classmates in relation to mainstream psychology. And it's to make sure that we get you through that fourth learning outcome of our unit, where you see those concepts of prejudice and discrimination. And also because these feature in how you're assessed in assessments 2 and 3, which is now starting to become our focus. So, learning outcome 4, explain how privilege, power, and oppression affects prejudice and discrimination and inequity. So, we allocate people to a social group and we use our understanding of that group to guide our understanding of everyone in that group. And some of the most common groups that people are allocated to are based on gender, sexuality, disability, ethnicity, age, religion, and nationality. And some of those groups are ones which people can argue themselves out of. And some of those groups they can't. And nationality is one that you can argue your way out of through acquiring citizenship of another country. But not everyone can do this. You typically need a chunk of money, but also to hold an existing citizenship that your new country is well disposed towards, or to have some value to your new country, or in some other way are seen as worthy enough to grant citizenship to. Basically, it's up to you whether you apply for citizenship, but not up to you whether you get it, because it's a decision made by a government. Nonetheless, it can be done, and it's done quite often. Other groups are much harder to move out of, and these are typically those groups that are constructed around either real or imagined biological or genetic traits. So sex is one. Now, you can undergo physiological and biological changes to alter your sex, but that's still often not sufficient for many societies to fully recognize you as belonging to that other group. And that's because largely women and men are two groups that have been constructed as a very rigid, non-dissolvable binary. They're constructed as opposites. So you're either one or the other. There's no in between, no moving in between. But the notion of sex being a binary between male and female is constructed socially. And we'll get more into that in week 8, because we've got a whole week on gender sexuality for that week. Ethnicity, this is another group that's difficult to move out of, because it's a group that's also constructed around biological or genetic traits. But these are imagined ones. And it's because it's still constructed around that now discredited notion of race. The notion of race is built on the assumption that people who live in different geographical areas and who belong to different cultural groups are genetically different from each other. But there's no basis for that assumption. Certainly no scientific evidence for it. There's no biological or genetic foundation to the concept of race. Now, that surprises people, but it's true. Genetically and biologically, there are no differences between ethnic groups that are meaningful or distinct. There's more genetic variance within a population of white people than there is, for example, between a population of white people and black people. It's a myth that race is biological. And it's a myth that's constructed as a fact and is perpetrated as a fact because it serves particular interests. And those interests are served by making that category non-fluid, so people can't move easily out of it. So in that way, race is actually being used as a kind of stable administrative category. It's a group you can allocate an individual to with relative confidence that once you've assigned them there, they won't be able to move out of it. What we know is that race was employed as an effective administrative category to separate the natives from the colonizers when Europeans were invading other people's countries. It was a box to put people into that they couldn't get out of. And if you can put someone into a box that they can't get out of, there's the potential then to be able to treat them quite badly without the fear that they're going to escape and come and seek retribution. They can't jump out of their box and into your box. Racism, sexism, and disableism have all become so widespread because they're seen as biological categories. But we know that race is not a biological concept, and disability rarely has genetic cause, and sex is significantly impacted by gender, with gender being a social rather than a biological concept. And the biological concept of sex, being a binary, is constructed socially. We kind of know those things, but most people aren't told those things. And that's because there's a lot of work that goes into this. There's a lot of maintenance work that goes into keeping those categories of race, sex, and disability in their biological boxes to ensure that people think of them as biological categories. And this is why those processes of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination persist. They require that sort of stability in how a group is characterized to allow those negative social practices to persist. Now, of course, we've got the social movements that feature quite heavily in this unit. They're always sitting there in the background, and they're pushing back on all of this stuff. But there's some interesting stuff going on there, and we'll get into that a little later in the unit. But in regards to gender and sexuality, the stereotypes about men and women largely persist. And in the next episode, I'll tell you what psychology has done about that. And it might surprise you. So till then, Ta-da.